The sun hammered the ochre dust of Redemption, New Mexico into a blinding sheet, bleaching the sky to a pale, unforgiving white. Jedediah Jed Stone squinted against the glare, the lines around his eyes etched deep, not just by the sun, but by a past he fought daily to forget. He tied his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Ghost, to the hitching post outside the general store, the worn leather of the reins familiar and grounding in his calloused hands. The town's main street was a collection of sun-scorched, clapboard buildings, their false fronts leaning like tired old men propped up by little more than memory. Jed's life was a quiet ritual of survival on a hardscrabble ranch miles from anywhere. He came to town only when necessity demanded it, for salt, for flour, for cartridges. He sought no company and offered none. The silence he carried was a heavy cloak, woven from the threads of a wife and child buried under a lone piñon pine. He was here for supplies, nothing more. A quick trade, a nod to the storekeeper, and then back to the solitude that was both his punishment and his only peace. He was halfway across the street when the world exploded. The sharp crack of a gunshot ripped through the sleepy afternoon hum. Glass from the bank's front window shattered outward, glittering like deadly diamonds in the oppressive sunlight. Men shouted. A woman screamed. Jed reacted without thinking, his body moving with an economy of motion honed by a former life he never spoke of. He dropped low behind a water trough, of the rough wood digging into his back. The air filled with acrid smoke and the coppery tang of fear. 4 riders burst from the bank canvas sacks slung over their shoulders. They moved with a brutal efficiency, firing into the air to scatter the few townsfolk who had dared to show their faces. Their leader, a tall man with a calm, almost leisurely confidence, swung into his saddle. He was dressed in a fine black coat, strangely formal for the grit and heat, and his face, clean-shaven and sharp, held a chilling intelligence. He directed his men with quiet hand gestures, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of chaos. This was Silas Kane. Though Jed did not yet know his name, he recognized the type of man for whom violence was not a passion, but a tool wielded with precision and without remorse. As Kane spurred his horse, a silver object dislodged by the sudden movement fell from his saddlebag. It hit the thick dust with a soft, unnoticed thud. The outlaws were gone in a thunder of hooves, leaving behind a stunned silence, broken only by the whimpering of a frightened child. Jed waited until the hoofbeats faded to a distant echo. He pushed himself to his feet, his senses on high alert. The town was beginning to stir, doors creaking open, faces peering out. Sheriff Brody, a man whose ambition had long outpaced his courage, emerged from his office, his gun drawn, but his expression more bewildered than brave. Jed's eyes were fixed on the object in the dust. He moved toward it, his boots scuffing the ground. He bent down and picked it up. It was a silver locket, tarnished and dented, but clearly an item of quality. It felt cool and heavy in his palm. His thumb, almost of its own accord, found the clasp and pressed. It sprang open. Inside, behind a small cracked pane of glass, was a miniature portrait. A woman with kind eyes and dark hair smiled out at him, a small boy with a serious expression nestled in her arms. The image struck Jed with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed from his lungs. The street, the shattered bank, the frightened townspeople. It all faded away, replaced by a searing, white-hot memory. Another woman, his Sarah. Another boy, his little Tom. Laughter in a sun-drenched meadow, followed by smoke, by screams, by a silence that had never ended. He snapped the locket shut, his knuckles white. The metal grew warm in his grip. This was not his grief. This locket belonged to the man who had just terrorized this town, a man who dealt in fear and death. And yet, this man carried a memory of love, of a family. The contradiction was a dissonant chord that resonated deep within Jed's own broken soul. Who was this man? This Silas Cain who could hold such tenderness and such cruelty in the same heart. Sheriff Brody stomped over his face, flushed. "Did you see which way they went, Stone? Any of them you recognize?" Jed closed his hand around the locket, the object becoming a secret. He shook his head, his voice a low rasp. Happened too fast. He didn't know why he lied. An instinct, perhaps a feeling that this was not a matter for a man like Brody. This felt personal. The locket was a question, and Jed, a man who had spent years avoiding answers, suddenly found himself compelled to find one. He pocketed the silver disc, its weight a strange anchor in the chaos. He had come to town for supplies, but he would leave with something far heavier, the beginning of a hunt he never intended to start. Back at his ranch, the silence was different. Before, it had been a hollow echo of what he had lost. Now it was filled with the ghost of the woman and child from the locket, their painted faces superimposed over the faces of his own dead family. The high desert landscape, once a comfort in its stark emptiness, now seemed to press in on him, the mesas and canyons holding their breath, waiting. Days turned into a week. Jed fell back into the rhythm of his chores, mending fences, tending to his few cattle, cleaning the weapons he hoped never to use again. But his movements were mechanical. His mind was elsewhere, turning the locket over and over in his thoughts. The silver felt like a brand in his pocket, a connection to a violent world he had tried so desperately to leave behind. It was during the second week, as a storm gathered its bruised purple skirts along the western horizon, that he saw her. A figure impossibly tall was walking steadily along the dusty track that led to his property. He stopped his work, a hammer resting in his hand, and watched her approach. She moved with a weary grace, a strange and solitary giant against the vast, empty canvas of the land. She was nearly 8 feet tall, her frame broad and powerful. Her dress, made of some rough homespun cloth, was torn at the shoulder, revealing a dark, mottled bruise. A strip of fabric was tied tightly around her ribs, stained with old blood. She carried no rifle, only a long knife sheathed at her hip. Her face, framed by a cascade of thick black hair, was a mask of stoic exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. This was Alara. She was an outcast born of a union between a prospector and a woman from a small nomadic tribe, a heritage that left her belonging to neither world. Her size had made her a spectacle, a target for ridicule and fear. She had been driven from her mother's people, who saw her as an ill omen, and shunned by the settlers, who saw her as something monstrous. She had been wandering for weeks, living off the land, the memory of pursuit a constant shadow at her back. Jed did not reach for the rifle leaning against the corral. He did not shout a warning. He simply waited, his posture neutral. He had seen enough of the world to know that true danger rarely announced itself so plainly. She stopped a dozen yards away, her gaze sweeping over him, the shack, the lone horse in the corral. Her throat was parched, but pride and caution kept her from asking for water. Jed saw the desperation she tried to hide. He saw the wound she favored. He saw the profound loneliness in her eyes, a loneliness that mirrored his own. Without a word, he walked to the water barrel, filled a dipper, and held it out. Her eyes, a deep, guarded brown, watched him for a long moment before she took it. She drank slowly, deliberately, never taking her eyes off him. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed. A jolt like static on a dry day passed between them. "There's stew on the fire." Jed said, his voice rough from disuse. "Shack's open if you need to get out of the wind." He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from or where she was going. He understood that some stories were too heavy to be carried in conversation. That choice, that lack of prying, was a language Alara understood better than words. Every other person she had encountered had demanded an explanation for her very existence. This man asked for nothing. She weighed her options. He was one man. If he meant her harm, she was confident she could overpower him. But there was no malice in his stance, only a quiet, bone-deep weariness she recognized. Her legs, weak from hunger and endless walking, trembled slightly. Pride told her to move on. Survival told her to stay. She chose survival. That night, the storm broke. Wind howled around the small shack, rattling the window frames. Rain fell in hard, slanted sheets. Inside, Alara sat by the fire, a bowl of stew held in her large hands. Jed sat opposite, cleaning his revolver, with methodical, practiced movements. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a shared space, a fragile truce between two solitary creatures who had found an unlikely harbor. He slept on the porch, wrapped in his bedroll, leaving her the bunk inside. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside and the steady rhythm of his breathing through the thin wall, Alara felt a knot of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to loosen. For the first time in a very long time, she was not alone. An alliance unspoken and fragile had been formed. It was a bond, not of friendship, but of mutual recognition. They were two broken pieces of a hard world temporarily fitted together against the storm. The next day, the threat that the locket represented arrived at Jed's doorstep. Two riders, their faces hard and their clothes layered with dust, reined in their horses at his fence line. They were not drifters. They had the cold, confident look of men who worked for someone powerful. One of them, a thick-set man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, dismounted. "Jedediah Stone," he called out, his voice carrying an easy arrogance. Jed emerged from the shack, Alara, a tall, imposing shadow in the doorway behind him. He didn't answer, just stood there waiting. "Name's Cowboy," the man said, gesturing vaguely at the land around them. "My employer has an interest in this territory. We're buying up all these parcels for the new railroad spur. Got a fair price for you. Save you the trouble of working this worthless dirt." Jed's eyes were steady. Not for sale. Calloway's smile was thin. "I don't think you understand. This isn't a negotiation. The railroad is coming through one way or another. You can take the money and walk away, or you can be persuaded." The other rider's hand drifted casually toward the butt of his pistol. Jed saw the movement, but his attention was on Calloway. He noticed a small detail, a silver pin on the man's collar, fashioned in the shape of a serpent eating its own tail. It was an unusual design, one that stuck in his mind. "I said it's not for sale," Jed repeated, his voice low and flat. Calloway's facade of civility cracked. His eyes flickered to Alara, a sneer twisting his lips. "So this is it? Hiding out here with a freak? You know a man's company says a lot about him." Before Jed could react, Alara stepped forward. The sheer scale of her was startling up close. She towered over Calloway, casting him in her shadow. She said nothing, but her presence was a statement more potent than any threat. Calloway took an involuntary step back, his bravado wavering. He looked from her to Jed, then spat on the ground. "Have it your way, Stone. But my employer is a patient man, only to a point. You'll be hearing from us again." He swung back onto his horse, and the two men rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and menace hanging in the air. Jed watched them go, his jaw tight. It wasn't just about the land. The talk of a railroad felt like a lie, a convenient story to mask a deeper motive. Then he remembered the locket. Silas Kane, the man from the bank, was a man of means, a man who would have employers like Calloway. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The robbery in town, the pressure on his land, they were connected. The owner of the silver locket was not some distant phantom. He was Jed's direct adversary. The fight he had tried to avoid had found him. He turned to Alara, They'll be back." She nodded, her expression grim. They are not men who ask twice. That evening, Jed took the locket from his pocket and opened it again, studying the faces of the woman and child. He was no longer just a bystander who had stumbled upon a mystery. He was a target. And to survive, he needed to understand the man who was hunting him. His path was clear. He had to go back to redemption, not for supplies, but for answers. And he had a feeling the first place to start looking was with the one man who should have been asking these questions himself, Sheriff Brody. Jed rode into redemption with a cold knot in his stomach. The town looked the same, but the underlying tension was palpable. People moved with a nervous energy, casting glances over their shoulders. The memory of the bank robbery was a fresh wound. He found Sheriff Brody in his office boots propped on his desk, idly cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke and neglect. Brody looked up as Jed entered, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Stone, what can I do for you unless you've suddenly remembered something useful about that robbery?" "I might have." Jed set his voice level. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "A man named Cowboy paid me a visit, tried to buy my land, said it was for the railroad." Brody feigned a thoughtful expression, though his eyes remained blank. "The railroad, that's progress, Stone. Good for the whole territory. You should have taken the offer." He had a man with him. They weren't surveyors. They were hired guns, Jed pressed. "And I've heard whispers. Other ranchers in the valley getting the same visits. Some have already packed up and left. It's not just me." "People get scared," Brody said with a dismissive shrug. "A robbery like that, it rattles folks. Maybe they just decided it's time to move on to safer country." The sheriff's casual indifference was a red flag. A proper lawman would be investigating, connecting the dots. Brody was actively avoiding them. Jed decided to push harder. "The leader of that gang," Jed said, watching the sheriff's face carefully. "The one in the black coat. You know his name?" Brody's hand paused its cleaning. "Silas Kane. Got a wire about him this morning. A nasty piece of work. Got a reputation from here to the border." "Why?" "Just a name to a face," Jed said. He knew he wouldn't get any real help here. Brody was either incompetent or complicit. Jed was betting on the latter. He turned to leave. "Stone," Brody called out, his voice taking on a harder edge. "A word of advice. You're a man who likes his privacy. Best way to keep it is to stay out of other people's business, especially men like Silas Kane. It's a good way to end up where your family is." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. It confirmed Jed's suspicions. The sheriff wasn't just ignoring the problem. He was part of it. Jed walked out into the blinding sunlight, the sheriff's words echoing in his ears. He was alone in this. No law, no support. Just him and Alara against a man who had the sheriff in his pocket. The ride back was tense. He felt watched. Twice he pulled Ghost to a halt and scanned the horizon, but saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze. The feeling lingered. He found Alara by the corral, sharpening the blade of her knife on a whetstone. She looked up as he dismounted, her eyes questioning. "The sheriff is with them," Jed said simply. Alara showed no surprise. She finished sharpening the blade, the metallic rasp of the only sound. "Then we cannot rely on the town." That night, they were not left in peace. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple, 3 of Kane's men rode up, Cowboy among them. This time, there was no pretense of a business transaction. "Last chance," Stone Cowboy shouted from the fence line. "Sign the deed or we burn you out." Jed stepped out of the shack, his Winchester rifle held loosely in his hands. "I told you." "The answer is no." The first shot came from one of the other men, a splinter of wood exploding from the porch post next to Jed's head. He ducked back, firing a single shot from the hip that sent the rider's horse rearing in panic. Gunfire erupted. Jed used the shack for cover, his shots measured and precise, aimed to disable, not to kill. He was a scout, a survivor, not a murderer. But Kane's men had no such reservations. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the shack. From the side, Alara emerged like a force of nature. She had circled around behind the woodpile, and in her hands she held a massive fence post ripped from the ground, which she wielded like a club. She swung it with incredible force, catching one of the rider's horse's broadside. The animal went down with a terrified squeal, throwing its rider. Calloway, enraged, turned his attention to her. He spurred his horse forward, drawing his pistol. Jed saw the danger. He aimed carefully and fired. The bullet struck Calloway in the shoulder, knocking him from his saddle. He landed hard, his pistol flying from his grasp. The third man, seeing his leader down and Alara advancing on him, lost his nerve. He wheeled his horse around and fled into the growing darkness. Jed cautiously approached Calloway, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of pain and fury. The other man, the one whose horse Alara had taken down, was struggling to his feet, his leg clearly broken. "This isn't over," Stone Calloway spat, blood staining his teeth. "Kane will hear about this. He'll peel the skin from your bones." "Get on your horse and ride," Jed said, his voice cold. "And tell Kane to come himself next time." He watched as Calloway, with the help of his injured companion, managed to get away. The silence they left behind was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and the promise of more violence. Jed turned to find Alara standing beside him. He noticed a dark stain spreading on her sleeve. A stray bullet had grazed her arm. "You're hurt," he said, his voice tight with concern. "It is nothing," she replied, though her face was pale. He led her inside. By the flickering lamplight, he cleaned and bandaged the wound. His touch was gentle, his movements efficient. As he worked, she watched his face, seeing the deep-seated weariness there, the profound sadness that never truly left his eyes. In that moment, their bond, forged in silence and shared hardship, deepened into something more. She had fought for his home. He was tending to her wounds. They were no longer just two outcasts sharing a piece of land. They were partners. "Thank you," he said quietly, tying off the bandage. She simply nodded, her hand resting on his for a second longer than necessary. In that touch, a new understanding passed between them. They were in this together until the end. And they both knew the end was coming, one way or another. In the aftermath of the attack, a profound shift occurred on the ranch. The fragile truce between Jed and Alara solidified into a true partnership, their days now dictated by a shared purpose to prepare for Kane's inevitable return. They worked together with an unspoken synergy, fortifying the small homestead against a coming war. Alara's knowledge of the terrain became their greatest asset. She showed Jed hidden springs he never knew existed, and paths through the canyons that were invisible to the untrained eye. She taught him which plants could be used for poultices, and which berries, though bitter, could sustain them if they were forced to flee. She moved through the harsh landscape not as an intruder, but as a native daughter, reading the signs in the rocks and the wind. Jed, in turn, drew on his past as a cavalry scout. He taught Alara how to reload a rifle quickly and efficiently, how to anticipate an enemy's movements, and how to use the sparse cover of the scrubland to their advantage. He set up a perimeter around the ranch, placing piles of stones in strategic locations that would serve as silent alarms if disturbed. His mind, once clouded by grief, was now sharp and focused, every instinct honed for survival. Their shared labor fostered a deep intimacy. Conversations were still sparse, but they no longer needed words. A glance, a nod, a shared look across the fire, these were their language. One evening, as they sat cleaning their weapons, the setting sun casting long shadows across the porch, Alara noticed a faded tattoo on Jed's forearm, mostly obscured by hair and sun-weathered skin, the insignia of a cavalry scout. "You were a soldier," she stated, not as a question. Jed's hands stilled. He had never spoken of his past to anyone. But looking at Alara, whose own history was written in the scars she bore, he found he could not lie. "A scout," he confirmed, his voice low. "A long time ago, I showed them the way. I thought I was helping to make the world safer." He looked down at his hands, at the faint tremor he could never quite control. "I was wrong." The confession hung in the air between them. Alara did not offer empty platitudes or judgment. She simply reached out and placed her large, warm hand over his, stilling the tremor. The gesture was one of profound acceptance. She too had been betrayed by the world she was born into. She understood. That night, something changed. The unspoken tension that had simmered between them for weeks finally gave way. In the quiet darkness of the shack, with only the sound of the crickets outside, they came together. It was not a moment of sudden passion, but a slow, quiet collision of two lonely souls, a desperate and tender affirmation of life in the face of ever-present death. It was a promise made not with words, but with a shared breath in the dark. In the weeks that followed, Alara began to show the first subtle signs of pregnancy. It was a truth that dawned on her slowly, a quiet knowledge that settled deep in her bones. The realization brought a complex storm of emotions, a fierce protective joy, mingled with a paralyzing fear. To bring a child into this violent, uncertain world felt like both a miracle and a curse. Their investigation into Silas Kane continued. Jed, using his tracking skills, began to piece together Kane's movements. He found a pattern. Kane's gang wasn't just robbing banks. They were systematically driving ranchers off their land along a specific corridor, the same corridor where the supposed railroad was planned, but there was no evidence of any legitimate railroad company. It was a land grab, pure and simple, orchestrated by Kane for a purpose Jed still couldn't fathom. Their feelings for one another deepened with each passing day. The child growing within Alara was a secret, powerful bond between them, a symbol of a future they dared to hope for. Jed found himself watching her with a tenderness he thought had died with his first family. He would find her gazing at the horizon, one hand resting on her stomach, and a fierce protective instinct would rise in him stronger than any grief. He knew he couldn't protect her by waiting for Kane to come to them. He had to take the fight to him. He had to uncover the truth behind Kane's obsession with this valley. Following a lead from a disgruntled prospector he'd spoken to in town, Jed found Kane's hideout, an abandoned silver mine carved into the base of a remote mesa. It was a formidable fortress, easily defended. Leaving Alara safely hidden in a canyon nook she had shown him, Jed scouted the location for 2 days, learning the guards' routines, mapping out the entrances and exits. He chose to go in at high noon when the oppressive heat made the guards lazy and the shadows were shortest. He moved like a ghost, a skill from his old life, returning with frightening ease. He slipped past the sentries and made his way into the cool darkness of the mine. He found Silas Kane in a large torch-lit cavern that served as his command center. Maps were spread across a makeshift table detailing the entire valley, with Jed's property circled in red. Kane was not alone. Sheriff Brody stood with him, poring over the maps. "It's the last piece," Sheriff Kane was saying, his voice smooth and confident. "Once Stone is out of the way, we control the entire aquifer. The water rights alone will be worth a fortune." Brody nodded, his expression greedy. "Just get it done, Kane. The longer this draws out, the more questions I have to fend off. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in Jed's mind. It wasn't about a railroad. It was about water, the lifeblood of the desert. Cain was creating a monopoly, and Sheriff Brody was his partner. Before Jed could retreat, a loose rock shifted under his boot. Cain's head snapped up, his eyes instantly locking onto Jed's hiding place in the shadows. He smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. "Well, well," Cain said, drawing a silver-plated revolver with unnerving speed. "Mr. Stone, I was just saying we should pay you another visit. You've saved me the trip." Jed stepped out of the shadows, his own revolver in his hand. "It's over, Cain." Cain laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Over, my dear man, it has barely begun." He gestured to the maps. "You see, you and I have something in common. We are both men who have lost everything. The only difference is, I know who to blame." Jed's finger tightened on the trigger. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Cain's smile vanished, replaced by a look of raw, bottomless grief. He reached into his coat and pulled out a familiar object. It was another silver locket, identical to the one Jed carried. He opened it, revealing the same portrait of the woman and child. 5 years ago, Cain said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the cavalry came through the San Simon Valley. They were hunting renegades, they said. But they had a scout, a very good one, who led them to a hostile encampment. It wasn't hostile. It was my home, my wife Maria, my son Leo. A cold dread washed over Jed. He remembered the San Simon Valley. He remembered the intelligence he'd provided, a map, a description of a small settlement by a creek. He had been told it was a holdout for a band of raiders. They burned it to the ground. Cain continued, his voice shaking with a rage that had been simmering for 5 years. I was away trading. When I returned, there was nothing left but ash and bone. The official report called it a successful engagement. They called my wife and my 4-year-old son collateral damage. Cain looked directly at Jed, his eyes burning with a terrible, righteous fire. The scout who led them there? The scout who provided the intelligence that murdered my family? Was you Jedediah Stone? The world tilted under Jed's feet. The memory he had suppressed, the guilt he had buried under years of solitude, rushed back with suffocating force. He had been the architect of this man's pain. His actions, however unintentional, had created the monster standing before him. My entire crime spree, as you call it, Cain said, his voice laced with venom, is a twisted quest for justice. I am tearing down the system that took everything from me. And I started with the men responsible. Men like you. The conflict was no longer about land or water. It was a deeply personal battle of grief and revenge. Jed was not fighting a simple outlaw. He was fighting the ghost of his own past, a dark mirror of his own loss. And in that moment, he understood that this was a fight that could not be won with a gun. The revelation in the mine shaft shattered Jed's world. He was not the victim in this story, not entirely. He was a cause, an unwitting catalyst for the very darkness that now threatened to consume him. He escaped the mine that day, but not the truth. The gunfight that should have happened never did. Cain let him go, a chilling gesture that said more than any bullet could. Live with it, Cain had hissed as Jed backed away into the darkness. Live with what you did. He returned to Alara, a changed man. The quiet certainty he had begun to build was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching guilt. He told her everything about his life as a scout, the raid in the San Simon Valley, and Cain's horrifying revelation. He expected her to recoil, to see him as a monster. Instead, she listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished the story laid bare between them like a wound, she simply said, "The past is a ghost. It only has the power you give it. Your fight is here, now, with us." Her unwavering faith in him was both a comfort and a burden. He did not feel worthy of it. Cain did not wait long to make his next move. With Sheriff Brody's help, he turned the town of Redemption against Jed. Brody spread the story that Jed was the real criminal and associate of Cain's, who had double-crossed him, and that the giant woman was his savage accomplice. Fear and prejudice, already simmering in the town, boiled over. The few who might have sympathized with Jed were cowed into silence. He was now an outlaw in the eyes of the very community he lived beside. They were completely and utterly alone. The homestead, once a sanctuary, became a prison. They were cut off with dwindling supplies and the constant threat of attack. Jed's guilt gnawed at him. He saw Cain's loss reflected in his own, a cycle of violence and grief that he had helped start. The final blow came on a moonless night. Jed was on watch, positioned on the ridge overlooking the ranch, when he saw them, a dozen riders led by Cain himself, moving silently toward the shack. He fired a warning shot and raced back, but he was too late. Cain had anticipated his movement, sending a second group to circle around from the opposite direction. They were surrounded. The ensuing firefight was short and brutal. Jed and Alara fought back-to-back, a desperate, valiant stand. But they were outnumbered. A bullet grazed Jed's temple, sending him staggering into darkness for a crucial second. When his vision cleared, Cain's men had breached their defenses. And they had Alara. She fought like a lioness, but they overwhelmed her with sheer numbers. Cain stood before her, his face impassive. "You will be my leverage, madam," he said coolly. "A message for our mutual friend." Jed saw it all from the cover of the rocks, his heart turning to ice. Alara, his Alara, pregnant with their child, was being led away. Cain looked directly at Jed's hiding place, a grim smile on his face. The old mission church at Diablo Canyon, Cain shouted into the night, his voice carrying on the wind. "Sunrise. Come alone, Stone, or she and the child will pay for your sins as well as their own." The riders disappeared into the darkness, taking with them everything Jed had left to live for. He was left alone in the wreckage of his home, the smell of gunpowder in the air, and the weight of two families, his and Cain's, on his soul. The path to redemption, he now realized, led straight through hell. And hell was a place called Diablo Canyon. The sandstorm hit just before dawn, a malevolent swirling wall of ochre dust that swallowed the landscape. It was as if the land itself was trying to scour the world clean. Wind howled through Diablo Canyon, a mournful banshee cry that echoed off the rock walls. In the heart of the storm stood the skeletal remains of an old Spanish mission church, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower, a jagged finger pointing at a sky the color of ash. Jed rode Ghost hard against the wind, his face wrapped in a bandana, the grit stinging his eyes. He was a man stripped down to a single burning purpose: save Alara. Save their child. Inside the church, the atmosphere was sepulchral. Dust filtered through the cracks in the walls, dancing in the faint light from a few scattered lanterns. The wind shrieked through the broken stained glass window, and high above a loose bell in the steeple tolled erratically, a frantic, dissonant heartbeat for the coming confrontation. Alara stood near the crumbling altar, her hands tied, guarded by two of Cain's men. She was calm, her posture defiant, her eyes fixed on the entrance. Silas Cain stood apart, a silhouette against the swirling dust, his black coat flapping in the wind. Jed entered through the main doors, a ghost emerging from the storm. His Winchester was in his hands, but he did not raise it. His eyes found Ilara's, a silent promise passing between them. "You came." Cain said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "I knew you would. A man will do anything to keep from losing his family." Again. "Let her go, Cain." Jed said, his voice a low growl. "This is between you and me." Cain laughed, the sound hollow in the cavernous space. "It was always between you and me, Stone. She is merely a participant in a passion play you wrote 5 years ago." He gestured to his men. They cocked their rifles, the sound sharp and final. The standoff was absolute. Jed was outgunned, and the storm raged outside, and the life of his new family hung by a thread. He had to think to find a way out that wasn't paved with more death. "You're wrong about what happened," Jed said, taking a slow step forward. "I was a scout, yes. I gave them the intelligence. But I was told your settlement was a den of murderers. I was lied to, Cain, just as you were." "Lies," Cain sneered. "The only lie is the one you tell yourself to sleep at night." "No," Jed said, his gaze unwavering. "The lie is the one that benefits the man who wanted us both out of the way. The man who wanted the land and the water. The man who stood to gain from both of our tragedies." Cain's composure flickered. A sliver of doubt entered his eyes. "Think about it." Jed pressed the pieces falling into place with dawning horror. "The raid that killed your family. It was unsanctioned, wasn't it? A special operation. And what about the raid on my ranch, the one that killed Sarah and Tom? The attackers were never found. It was written off as a random act of violence. But nothing in this territory is random." He took another step, his voice rising over the storm. "There's one man who connects it all. One man who knew the cavalry patrol routes and the location of my ranch. The one man who is your partner in this land grab. Sheriff Brody." Cain stared at him, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. "He orchestrated it all." Jed's voice was raw with the terrible certainty of the truth. "He used the cavalry to eliminate you, a rival for the land. Then he used raiders to eliminate me, clearing another parcel. He created 2 broken, vengeful men and then stepped back to watch them destroy each other while he collected the prizes. We are not enemies. We are his puppets." The truth, when it landed, was more devastating than any bullet. Cain looked at Jed, seeing not a murderer, but a mirror of his own suffering. He saw a fellow victim, a man manipulated and shattered by the same corrupt hand. At that moment, the storm outside reached its zenith. A furious gust of wind tore through the church, ripping a loose section of the roof free. A massive wooden beam crashed down, striking one of Cain's men. The other guard, startled, turned his head for a fraction of a second. It was the opening Jed needed. He dove forward, firing the Winchester. The shot went wide, but the distraction was enough. Ilara, with a powerful surge of strength, snapped the ropes binding her wrists. She grabbed a fallen piece of debris and swung, knocking the second guard off his feet. Cain stood frozen. The gun in his hand, lowered his face, a mask of agony, as the full weight of Jed's revelation crushed him. He was no longer a righteous avenger. He was a pawn. From outside, Sheriff Brody appeared in the doorway, his pistol drawn, a look of panic on his face. He had come to witness the end, but the play had not gone according to his script. "Cain, kill him!" Brody shrieked over the wind. Cain slowly raised his head, his eyes burning with a new terrible fire. He turned his gun not on Jed, but on the sheriff. "You," Cain whispered the word, filled with 5 years of redirected hate. Brody fired wildly. Jed pushed Ilara to the ground, shielding her with his body, as the church dissolved into chaos. Cain returned fire. The loose bell in the steeple, struck by a stray bullet, broke free from its moorings. It plummeted downward, crashing through the rotted floorboards of the bell tower and into the nave below with a deafening final clang. When the dust settled, Sheriff Brody lay dead in the doorway. Silas Kane stood over him, a broken man. His revenge was complete, but it was hollow, meaningless. He looked at Jed, at the woman, and the unborn child he had almost destroyed. He dropped his gun. "It's finished," Kane said, his voice empty. He turned and walked out of the church, disappearing into the raging heart of the sandstorm, a ghost returning to the dust. Jed did not stop him. Vengeance had no place here, not anymore. He rushed to Alara's side, helping her to her feet, holding her close as the storm began at last to subside. They had survived. As the first rays of dawn broke through the receding dust clouds, Jed and Alara emerged from the ruined church. The world was washed clean, the air crisp and cool. They returned to redemption not as fugitives, but as witnesses. Jed laid Sheriff Brody's body in the middle of the main street. He didn't have to say a word. The townspeople gathered their faces, a mixture of fear and confusion. Jed then went to the sheriff's office. Tucked away in a locked drawer, he found what he was looking for: doctored deeds, falsified reports, and letters detailing the illegal land grab, all implicating Brody. He even found the original cavalry report from the San Simon Valley raid with Brody's signature authorizing the necessary action. He nailed the documents to the door of the sheriff's office for all to see. The town's justice was swift. The people, humbled and ashamed of their part in condemning an innocent man, formed a council. They seized Brody's assets and nullified the fraudulent land claims, returning the deeds to the ranchers who had been driven away. They offered Jed the position of sheriff, but he refused. His time as a public servant was long over. He and Alara returned to their damaged homestead. The community, in a quiet act of penance, helped them rebuild. Men who had once whispered insults now hammered nails into his new porch. Women who had sneered at Alara now left baskets of bread and salted meat at their fence line. Acceptance came not in words, but in deeds. A few weeks later, Alara gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Hope. She was born into a world that was still harsh, but no longer entirely without kindness. The shack, once a lonely outpost, was now filled with the sounds of a family. One clear, cool morning, Jed rode out to the lone pinyon pine that marked the graves of his first wife and child. He carried with him the silver locket that had started it all, Silas Kane's locket. For a long time he stood before the simple wooden crosses, the silence of the high desert, his only companion. He had carried his guilt like a shroud for years, a self-imposed penance for a past he couldn't change. But looking at the locket, at the faces of another man's lost family, he finally understood. Grief was not a contest. Pain was not a debt to be paid. They were simply burdens to be carried and perhaps eventually to be set down. He knelt and gently placed the silver locket on the mound of earth beneath Sarah's cross. It was a gesture of farewell, not only to his own ghosts, but to Kane's as well. He was letting go of the guilt, accepting the past, and turning his face toward the future. He mounted Ghost and rode back toward the homestead. From the ridge he could see the ranch, a small but defiant bastion of life against the vast landscape. He saw Alara step out onto the porch, their daughter cradled in her arms, her impossibly tall form a beacon of strength and love. She raised a hand in welcome. Jed urged Ghost into a steady trot, riding toward his home, toward his new family, toward the hard-won peace that waited for him. The sun was warm on his back, the sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence within him was not empty. It was full.